Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Alison, one of the co-founders of Scriba. For those of you who haven't come across Scriba before, we are a platform that supports governance and operational meetings, primarily in schools and trusts. We use AI and technology to help create agendas, minutes, and actions, reducing the admin burden around meetings. Over the last year, we spent a lot of time thinking about meetings. Initially, that was focused on the outputs and documentation, the agendas, the minutes, the actions. But we've also had lots of conversations with some of you on the call about what exactly makes a meeting effective, and specifically the importance of that human element, how people communicate, how different personalities interact, how we navigate often complex dynamics, and ultimately how we create more productive discussions and better outcomes around the table. So, with that goal in mind, I'm really delighted to be joined by Fiona Dorman and Lacey for the first in our webinar series looking at purposeful meetings. So, Fiona Dorman is a leadership and communication consultant who works with schools, trusts, and other organisations across the UK and internationally, using coaching and psychometric colour profiling to help teams improve communication and work more effectively together. Jack is Director of Education at Amplify Education, a new 21 school trust in the Bristol area, and brings extensive leadership experience from across the sector. Between them, Fiona and Jack have spent pretty much all their careers, I think it's fair to say, supporting teams, leading organisations, and helping people work more effectively together. So we're aiming for the session to last 30 minutes, really conscious of your time, and we'll try and keep it as short as possible. We will leave some time for questions at the end. So if there's anything you'd like to ask during the session, please use the Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll do our best to cover as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jack and Fiona.
Thank you, Alison. Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So Fiona and I understand from Alison that most of the attendees this afternoon are people working in or around the world of governance. And we are starting with a premise. And our premise is that when you are thinking about the composition of your governing bodies, you will no doubt have done some kind of skills audit and thought carefully about making sure that the makeup of your governing body is made up of people who bring different areas of expertise to the meetings. So no doubt there will be people who come with a strong background in finance. You've probably got someone with HR expertise, perhaps buildings, health and safety, etc. But our assumption is that when thinking about the makeup of your governing bodies or your boards, you may have thought less about the behaviours of those who make up your teams, and that possibly more attention has been given to skills than behaviours. At Amplify Education, we've been working closely with Fiona over a number of years now and used a profiling tool known as CME. We often refer to it as the colour wheel. And this has helped us to get real insight into how our teams work and the makeup, the behaviours that are shown by different members of our teams. We use it extensively across our organisations, but today we're going to think particularly about how it works when we, in relation to governing bodies. So Fiona's going to talk us through, give us a brief overview of how CME works. I'm going to draw on a few examples of where we've used it, and then we're going to open the floor up for questions. So Fiona, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jack. Brilliant. So yes, we're just going to present this as a tool that's something really useful in terms of diversity of thinking and behaviour. And one thing that's really interesting working with quite a lot of boards across the years and thinking a lot about the makeup of boards and how crucial it is in terms of governance to get that right, is to think about this idea of different ways of thinking and being that you bring together that can create a really strong, effective board that is able to do what you need it to do, basically. And this tool, a colour tool, is, so we just thought we'd just whip through really quickly a few sort of heads up on this. Obviously, this is an entire package that you can be trained up in and you can think about. We're going to look at a few of the main parts of this just to sort of get you to start thinking about this idea of different ways of thinking and different behaviours that might impact on the way a board works. So the tool really is sort of structured around the idea that is to try and sort of collate similar behaviours together. It's really important, I think, with stuff like this, that we're not talking about kind of I don't ever talk about different personalities or different characters. I'm talking a lot about behaviours. What do people do, and how do you behave when you're in a room together? What are you likely to do at that point? What's a kind of comfortable, normal behaviour to one person? What's a comfortable, normal behaviour to another person? And how do they intersect? And how do they create strength, but also a bit of useful friction from time to time? So the tool really is trying to think about people, and it uses colour in order to make it quite simple and to block together 4 fairly baggy but sort of discernible sets of different strengths that I think people bring. So on this first slide here, you can see some of the ways that you might kind of cluster together different behaviours that sort of feel like you can see and experience them. So here's some resilient strengths. This one's around how people might be doing things differently. So if we go back to the first one, I would talk about people who are operating out of sort of leading in a red preference way, people who are leading a yellow preference, a green and a blue. And what I mean by that really is I think what is preferable and comfortable for people in the room. So our red preference is a lot around people who are very good at being quite direct, quite challenging. They're really good in terms of being quite bold. They will drive quite hard for delivery. That's quite different to people who have got a slightly different way of behaving, that they might be more comfortable with looking for consensual decisions. They might be thinking carefully about trying to include all the voices. Their go-to behavior might be much more comfortable with a bit more diplomatic, tactful style. Other people will sit with a much higher blue preference. So they're looking for detail. They're thinking about facts, thinking a lot around wanting to analyze and bring clarity to quite complex things. Whereas other people in the room who've got more of a yellow preference behavior will probably bring a lot of creativity, perhaps will be quite expressive, might use a lot of words, might be thinking about how we're going to be inspirational and visionary. So you've got sort of, my premise is you've got different people doing different things. One thing that's really important to say is in many years of working like this, that it's obvious that no one is any one thing. Lots of people are lots of different things. But what's really interesting, I think, particularly in boards, is who sort of prefers different behaviours and how does that make you behave inside a meeting? What does that make you think? How do you look at a situation? So we often talk about if you've got one situation in the middle of the room and you're trying to make a decision about it, how are different people looking at that? How are they processing that? What are they thinking about that? And how is that different? It's really interesting with boards to think about when you've got different sensibilities and different behaviours coming at one thing. People can come up with quite different ideas about something. And sometimes that is really helpful. It's a sort of diversity of thinking that I think is quite useful, particularly for governance. It's really helpful to have people thinking in lots of different directions. So really what Amplify have done with this tool is try to use it as a way of encouraging people to think really about themselves and then to think about, well, what kind of thinking am I bringing? Do I know what that is? Do I know what my preferences are? And how does that shape how I might input into a different meeting? So the colour tool sort of like looks at strengths that people might have. It then talks about development areas, which again is interesting to know what you're not. So for myself, I know that one of those colour blocks is a bit lower in me. I'm not so good at that. So that would definitely for me be something around the blue. So I'm not great with loads of detail. I'm really much better on big picture. I'm quite good at being fairly action oriented. I quite like a bit of that green stuff. I'm not so good on that. But I know that about myself. So it's always interesting to think, well, do I need to sort of try and deliberately match myself with someone who does bring that so we can kind of work together? Or if I'm in a room where there's a lot of detail, do I myself know that I might be switching off a bit, and how useful is that or not? So again, it's a little bit about kind of knowing your own boundaries and knowing what you bring to the session and how you behave inside a meeting. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, about really trying to assess boards and think about different behaviours is what people are doing and how they might be making decisions, how they might be acting inside the meeting so that everyone gets something to say and everyone inputs in different ways. And you can tolerate other people inside the meeting. So there's some interesting work that we've done around, okay, people who are operating in what I would describe as more of that kind of red-blue preference, what are they how are they likely to show up? Are they going to be quite businesslike? Are they going to be quite organised and orderly? Are they going to bring quite a pragmatic approach to decisions and conversations? Whereas people are going to come in with more of that green-yellow preference. How are they going to show up? Are they going to be wanting to be quite flexible with decisions? Are they wanting to really kind of highlight and centralize the people issues around something? Not at the expense of kind of pragmatic decision making, but it might be quite important to them, and that might be something they really bring in, and they're able to sort of, and you can see them focusing on that. They are different, and it's really interesting to know, well, how are we different, and what are we using, and how does the difference kind of work well, particularly when you're trying to set up boards that work well and think well and make good decisions. Another thing that's interesting, I think, around this is to think about, do you have a kind of equal or different balance between more kind of reflective behaviours and a bit more extrovert behaviours? This one's really interesting, I think, when it comes to teams and conversations in groups, because sometimes you can have people who just make more noise and say more things, and sometimes you've got people who make a lot less noise and say a lot less things. And sometimes we put value on words and we don't notice that someone's doing a lot of good thinking. And it's about, do we give everyone time and space to input in the way that they need to input and bring what they need to bring? So again, you can see some people are going to be much more expressive. They're going to use a lot of words. Other people, I think, inside rooms use less words. They do more reflection in their head, and then they're going to just be a bit quieter. Nothing is right and wrong. I just think it's really interesting to assess who's in the room, what have you got, and how do you kind of make sure that everything is inputted and everything is productive in terms of meeting the needs of that your board has. I think a lot of this is interesting to think that on a board, do we kind of cover all the different bases? So again, what colour wheel profiling looks at is sort of, again, how people prefer different spaces or might be more comfortable with different conversations. So some people are very strategic and quite quick. Some people lean much more to operational and want a bit more time. Some people are very inclusive, want to empower other people. Other people are excellent at challenge and supporting. And again, it's interesting to look at boards and think, okay, well, where's this spread? What have we got? What's working and what's not working? Another bit of work that I do a lot of work in is in the sort of field of disputes. And again, it's really interesting in disputes. I use this thinking all the time to try and think about, okay, how are we operating together? How are we working well together? Have we got lots of people that all think in the same way? Is that good? Have we got people that are spread out thinking all in different ways but can't kind of tolerate each other? How does that work? It's just an interesting tool, I think, to allow people to step back and consider what's in the room. I'm going very quickly, so I just want to get through different things. It's also interesting to note then how different people do different things inside a meeting, and how they will focus, and how we or you might have a different sense of what looks like a good way to behave and what you're not quite so comfortable with. So again, it's interesting to use colour as just a lens to look through, to think about, okay, different people might have different ways of behaving inside a meeting. And do we know that? And do we allow all those behaviours? Do they all work together? Are there some that dominate? Are there others that are a bit quieter? And have we got that kind of diversity of different behaviours that will ultimately give us a lot more to work with when we're trying to make good decisions? It's also interesting, I think, personally, to think about what you might do when things get difficult. Sometimes it's very difficult being on a board, and it's very difficult being on a governing body. I have done both, and they're complicated. And sometimes it's hard to get through problems. And it's really interesting to know kind of, I think, partly what you do when you get to difficulties, and also what other people do, and then how you can work through that without just thinking, oh, they're not doing it right, or this is rubbish, or I hate everyone. This is like a different lens to kind of go through and think, okay, well, what's actually going on here? We've got different people with different behaviours, thinking in different ways. What can we do about that? And how can we make good, sensible decisions that really progress what you need to progress? The final thing I just wanted to draw attention to is, I think that it's really interesting, particularly on a board, to think about who's asking what questions, and can we hear all the different questions that are being asked. I know personally, when I was running a team, I'm really comfortable with some questions on this sheet. I'm very comfortable with questions around that yellow down the bottom. So I love questions about, are our values being upheld? What are we going to celebrate for where's our first celebration? Is this innovative? Is it exciting? I really hated questions about, is it efficient, Fiona? Are we going to hit our targets? Is this going to actually have any impact? Oh, but I need to ask those questions because they're really important. And again, it's interesting to think about, do we have people asking lots of different questions? Are people coming from different perspectives? What do we hear? What don't we hear? And colour, again, is a way of kind of ensuring that we've got a full spectrum, I think, of different thinking, different perspectives, different understandings. And if you can bring it together and make that work, there's the tricky bit, then you have a really powerful, potentially powerful group to work with. Jack.
Thank you, Fiona. So we thought what we do now is just think about some examples where, and drawing on my own experience, I've having worked with lots of different governing bodies and lots of different schools and trusts over the years, where perhaps there hasn't been that diversity of perspective, where one colour has had a slightly louder presence within the room. And as a result, things perhaps haven't worked as effectively as they could have done. So I was thinking about this carefully and thinking about different boards I've worked with over the years. And certainly one came to mind where there was a very strong red energy. The chair of governors of this school, undoubtedly very red, fast paced, took things from the front, led with real clarity and conviction, perhaps didn't always take everyone with them, and perhaps through a little bit of unconscious bias had recruited people to the board, perhaps in their own image to some degree. Meanwhile, the school's leadership team very much made up of people with a strong green behaviours and preference. And there were times where that red energy from the board was very helpful. Things got were made quickly, efficiently. Things got moved on at pace. But it also led to conflict because from the school executive team's perspective, that could often come across as confrontational, adversarial. And really the relationship between the leadership team and the governing bodies started to break down over time. So the solution to that was actually to bring somebody in to observe what was going on, what was the interplay between those two different factions within the governing body. So we employed somebody to come in, act as a facilitator, observe what was happening, and really hold a mirror up and shine a light on the fact that there were people who were approaching meetings from two very, very different perspectives. On the back of that, following that, we then encouraged all of the governing body and the executive team to undertake the CME profiling tool, use the tool to build a better understanding of themselves and the dynamic between them. And that really helped to start to neutralize some of that conflict because people started to build a respect for difference ultimately and see that actually if they harnessed this in the right way, they could use it to their advantage. A different school, different time, different occasion, worked with a governing body, very blue preference. Again, I think this was probably driven by the chair of governors' typical way of working. And the way that played out is 90%, it turned out, of meeting time at its worst was spent on reviewing policies. And that may be something that's familiar to some of you in the meeting today. So the minutiae and the intricacies of every policy were gone through with fine detail, and it left very little space for bigger picture strategic thinking. The head teacher of the school started to get very frustrated about this because they just felt there wasn't that space to explore bigger issues, bigger challenges and considerations for the school. And the way we found to go through that is really to sort of play the blues at their own game, knowing that blues like information, like detail. What we did is we calculated the amount of time that was spent on policies. And as I said, it literally was 90% of meetings. And when that information was presented back to the blues on the governing body, it helped them to realize that perhaps things weren't quite in balance. And that really was enough to try and shift things over time and get a healthier balance of how time was spent in meetings. Third example, more recently, I've been working with a governing body, not a school in our trust, a school we've been supporting, a very, very strong yellow-green presence. So lovely, supportive, kind, empowering governing body, very concerned about the well-being of the leadership team, very supportive. I think probably fair to say not enough challenge, something that's been highlighted by Ofsted and actually for the head teacher, a source of frustration at times as well, because they felt they had to almost scaffold some of that challenge for the governing body, provide prompts and cues and opportunities where they could and should be challenging for them. And this required a different approach. And really, this was a bit more radical. It was about really thinking a bit more carefully about who was there, who was in the room. Did we have people who were coming with the right skill set, the right expertise, and the confidence to provide some of that challenge? So we brought some new people onto the team. They effectively modelled that challenge and were there. It was almost like a short-term project. That again gave the rest of the governing body the skills and confidence and experience of doing that and helped to balance things out over time. Fiona, I'm going to hand back to you for a bit of a wrap up, and then I think we're going to move over to Alison for some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack. Yeah. So really, I think the message is that it's a really interesting tool that we've used a lot in Jack's trust, but also I've used personally lots of different trusts and charities and business to help people think about how are meetings working, what have we got in the room, how does someone bring, can we cope and bring challenge? Do we have different sorts of behaviours that working well together? And it's complex to work with people. It's complex to work with people who are different. And how do you kind of manage that complexity? And I guess a lot of this is about harnessing the diversity of thinking that's inside a room already and being quite explicit about that. But also it's a nice tool just to sort of stand back and sort of examine what is there and how do we use all these different behaviours and different strengths so they work well together and they don't end up in complicated either conflict or everyone just clustered around one behaviour type. So you're just in the same camp and you're in a kind of little space that you can't really hear anything different. So it's just a really interesting tool from that perspective that has been helpful in the context in which we work. Yes, we'd love to take a few questions about this because I've realised this is like a whole day's training chucked at you in a matter of minutes. So I think Alison's going to coordinate a few questions. Alison.
Yeah. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Jack. A couple of really quick questions for you. So one of the questions we've got is how can you use those colour wheel insights in meetings without stereotyping? Because obviously there's a risk there that you approach it with a set kind of view on people.
Yeah, and there is a massive risk in any of this that you end up shoving people in a little box and there they stay. I think one of the things about the colour tool is that it looks for the blend that different people are different blends. And also it's trying to talk about the fact, well, I might be light on that blue or the blue strength. That might not be particularly preferable for me, but there's no reason why I can't flex up and learn how to do that. And in a way, it kind of gives you a kind of understanding of, okay, actually this is really helpful. And I need to learn and deliver that at certain points. I think it is difficult with anything like this not to be stereotyping, but I think if you manage to sort of see the different humans in the room and you look at where people's preferences, it's just a preference. It's not a definition. It's just that some people prefer to do it like this. Some people prefer to do it like this. It also, I think, outs a little bit of what feels normal because different people have a different sense of what's normal and right and good. And a tool like this really is about being able to just step back from yourself a little bit and go, well, I feel quite comfortable with this. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, but I recognise that that's useful. So I guess the answer to that is that it's a discipline not to just leverage this and use it in a light and dismissive manner. It's useful, I think, a lot in terms of thinking about yourself and how you operate, but also it's useful as a sort of a little sense check of like, well, what do we have a lot of and what do we have a little of? And try and sort of move into those areas. Everyone can flex and everyone can do all of this. It's interesting to know what your preference is.
Thanks, Fiona. And thinking specifically about those kind of meeting dynamics and people around the table, is there anything that chairs can do in particular just to encourage the quieter personalities in the room to contribute?
Shall I pick that one first, Fiona? Yeah. So, I mean, just a couple of kind of just practical strategies, Alison. Like, so it might be that asking for responses in advance of the meeting could be helpful, either in writing or having a conversation with people in advance. It might be that just kind of teeing some of those people up in advance and just letting them know that some things on the agenda that they bring particular expertise and knowledge in will be discussed and that their input would be really valued. It could be simply just structuring the meeting in a way that we're going around the circle and making sure everybody's voice is heard. Fiona's touched on this already, but the likelihood is that some of those quieter voices may have a stronger kind of blue preference. And we know that blues tend to like information and in advance. So making sure they have that and perhaps again sort of drawing on them when some of that kind of analysis of information is important in a meeting. So some of the more kind of complex, dense documents and things to draw on, that's when some of those quieter voices may actually have real expertise and confidence that can be drawn out.
I think if you know your colours as well, one thing you can do is deliberately set up groups where people are in with people who are quite similar. So actually more yellow-red preference do a lot of external processing. And so actually sometimes having a little time when they can do all that and then you contribute into the main group. So they're not kind of overwhelming people who've got much bigger preference just to do a bit of thinking and reflecting. They can talk, externally process, and then input their thoughts along with people who are happier just to do a bit more personal reflection. If you know your colours, you can deliberately move people around and set up groups so that everyone, I think, inputs quite well.
I think we've got time just for one more question, if that's all right. So final question is just, how do you balance that kind of challenge with maintaining positive relationships?
Well, I think this is when this comes in really helpful, because sometimes challenge is often not heard as challenge. It's heard as deep criticism or attack or someone being unpleasant. And actually, a lot of the time, it isn't. It is just a sort of challenging statement, possibly delivered quite bluntly. So a lot of the beauty of this kind of tool is also your ability to process what you're hearing. So if you understand that challenge is coming as in a sort of from someone who's got a lot of red preference, and I think you can hear it in a different way. The other thing you can do with this is you can deliberately sit in places where you adopt a sense. You go, look, I'm going to put on a bit of a red hat here, and I'm going to throw in a bit of challenge here. Again, it just like distances you from being personal or people taking that as critique. You're sort of just trying to think through the challenge bit. Similarly, some meetings I've been in, people have deliberately gone, look, we're all going to put on a bit of a blue hat here because we need to think more detail. So you can use it as a bit of a way to sort of diversify your own thinking, I think, inside the room. Anything else, Jack, that I've missed?
Well, I think just to build on that, the thing that I've taken from using See Me is just to develop a real respect for difference and respect for different ways of thinking. And I think when you come with that perspective, you stop seeing challenge as challenging. You start seeing it as that person is coming from that perspective. That's just their starting point, and that's fine, and that's good, and that's helpful and healthy for us all to have bring to the party different points of view.
Great. Thank you both. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Hopefully, I appreciate it's been a really short session, and probably, Fiona, you normally spend, like you said, a whole kind of
all
half
day.
Yeah, on this. So we've condensed it into a very short amount of time. But hopefully it's provided some food for thought. We'll send a follow-up email with a recording of the webinar along with Fiona's details. If anyone wants to find out more, do get in touch with Fiona. And then if you're interested in a slightly different angle on meetings, we've got a webinar next week with Sir David Carter, former National Schools Commissioner for England, and looking at that from the point of view of how you lead meetings and looking at creating that meeting culture. Again, it's very short, sharp, but hopefully some more things to take away from that session too. Thanks again for joining us. Hope to see you all again soon, and hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.